Welcome to part 3 of our 4-part series on bovine fetal gender determination, where we will focus on identification of the female fetus. As a reminder, we are looking to identify the female genital tubercle, which is the embryological structure that migrates from between the hind limbs to its final location under the tail. The GT will have reached this location by about 60 days, making 60 to 80 days the easiest and most ideal gestational range for fetal sexing. The female GT is identified adjacent to the tail in both the gross specimen and the ultrasound images seen here. Remember that fetal gender ID depends upon your ability to locate the umbilicus, which is the major landmark for confirming the presence or absence of a male GT. This tends to be the easier site to visualize, and you will want both a positive and a negative identification with each gender determination that you do. The umbilicus is a thick stalk of tissue with large vessels running through it, and it will exit the fetal abdomen on the ventral side, as seen here in different planes. I think identifying females can be a little tougher than males. The male GT sits right next to the larger, less echogenic umbilicus as a landmark, while the female GT sits just under the tailhead, which can look very similar in size and echogenicity. It can take some time and skill to make the small movements necessary to determine that there are two distinct structures visible at the caudal aspect of the fetal body. This is where a negative male ID really aids in confident diagnosis. Don't forget to look for a twin. Up to 95% of heifer calves born twin to a male will be sterile. If your imaging plane is obliqued, there's a lot of fetal bone in the area of the pelvis that can be mistaken for a female GT. Take your time to get a good symmetrical view and make small movements to determine the presence or absence of a female GT. And as with males, be aware that upwards of 70 to 80 days of gestation, the GT matures into less dense tissue and will be a little bit less distinct. You'll start to see the larger, rounder, more soft tissue appearance of a vulva under the tail approaching the 100-day mark. In our first example, this 60-day fetus is oriented in a transverse plane, and we're moving from the head back through the body toward the tail. As the umbilicus passes, there is no adjacent male GT seen. At the caudal aspect of the fetal body, we're able to visualize a bright white female GT under the tail. This image is also taken in a transverse plane, this time starting at the tail. We see cross-sections of the two hind limbs and the tail, and a very obvious female GT. Fanning forward through the fetal body, we come to the umbilicus and do not visualize a male GT adjacent to it. This 74-day heifer doesn't necessarily look any bigger because the depth is set to scan deeper than the last couple of images. As you may be starting to see, the transverse plane is a nice choice for IDing the female fetus. Once again, we see the female GT at the beginning of the clip, next to the base of the tail, and as we move forward through the abdomen, there is no male GT before the umbilicus comes into view. While this is still a mostly transverse view, it's slightly obliqued, and this heifer calf is a little further along and turned upside down, with her feet pointing up toward the transducer. At the beginning of the clip, you can see the highly echogenic vertebrae of the tail, as well as a distinct female GT. The umbilicus overlaps with the abdomen as we scan forward, but there's no male GT seen. This is a beautiful image of a well-developed 84-day pregnancy. Once again, we start at the hind end, seeing the individual bones in the tail, and a very clear female GT, which is looking more like a vulva at this point, under the tail. We see the umbilicus exit the body, and no male GT is present. At 106 days, we've gotten lucky with the positioning of this calf and are able to reach the anatomy that we need to see in order to make a gender identification. The well-developed fetal skeleton is casting a bit of shadow, but it's still small enough to get our bearings. The female GT is a little hard to appreciate on our first look at the hindquarters, but as we scan forward, we see a very clear umbilicus with no male GT in sight. We then reverse our probe movement and head back to the caudal aspect of the fetal body and get a nice look at the female GT under the tail head. As always, credit and thanks to Dr. Sandy Curran for her lovely images.